Coach John Calipari makes his return to Lexington to face his old school in February, one of many exciting matchups on the SEC calendar.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Wednesday. Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton, joined today by Leaf to Lean of the Locked On NBA Big Board, as well as hosting the Locked On Jazz podcast for a time right now. You're joining us at the place, folks, to get your college basketball content Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year. We are here for you every single day. Want to give a special shout out to those everyday listeners and those of you who are hanging out with us on the Locked On College Basketball Discord channel. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by Game Time. Folks, download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code Locked On College, and you will get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Well, the SEC schedule is officially out. We're talking Coach Calipari's return to Lexington as the head coach at Arkansas, what that means for both those squads. We're also going to talk about some fun other SEC storylines, the first matchups for Texas and Oklahoma as new members of the conference, some other games that stand out to us when looking through that schedule. And then we're closing the show about an hour before we hit the record button here. We saw the matchups are officially set for the battle for Atlantis. We're going to talk about what those matchups look like and a potential championship battle that could be one of the most fun non-conference games of the entire season. All coming up on today's show. But first, we got to start with Coach Calipari. Anytime you get an opportunity to talk about Coach Cal, Kentucky, Arkansas, everything going on with those two teams right now, it is the biggest story in college basketball. Even as Danny Hurley and the UConn Huskies chase a three-peat, it's hard to ignore Coach Calipari. He's always one of the more polarizing coaches in the coaching space. And so we finally get a date for this matchup. And one of the things that we knew ahead of time, Leaf, was that there was only going to be one matchup between these two teams. And we're obviously happy that it is happening in Lexington as opposed to Fayetteville. It still feels like we'd love to see these teams play each other twice, but after 15 years for John Calipari at Kentucky, he takes the Arkansas job this offseason. As Eric Musselman moves over to USC. The relationship between Kentucky and Calipari at the end was frayed, to say the very least, with a lack of NCAA tournament success for the last half decade or so. Some refusal to change some of his strategies and from a recruiting perspective and just from a X's and O's perspective. And not only does he leave and head to Arkansas, he takes 3 former Kentucky players with him and 3 Kentucky recruits with him as well. He brings Big Z's, Zvonimir Ivicic, he brings DJ Wagner, he brings Aidoo Thiero, all with him to Fayetteville. He also brings Boogie Fland, Carter Knox, and Billy Richmond in that recruiting class. So I say all of this to ask this question, Leaf. Is there a more exciting conference matchup in college basketball this upcoming season than Calipari's return to Lexington on February 1st?
Yes, because Duke and Carolina still exists.
Yeah.
That's the only one. That's the only one because it's the best rivalry in college basketball. And that both those teams, in my opinion, are top 5 teams.
Yeah.
So while Arkansas and Kentucky has this vitriol around it from one side, and maybe the Kentucky fans will give them some cheers, I kind of think there's going to be some boos speckled in there.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when Ed Cooley. It's a far bigger version of when Ed Cooley returned to Providence with Georgetown. I think there's going to be some fans that appreciate what he did, and others are like, "Oh well, you're against us now. You left us. You're dead to us." And both these teams to me are kind of 11 through 25. Like I think Arkansas has the better roster on paper because of Calipari. Like what he did was he took those 6 players you mentioned. He also got a potential All-American in Jonell Davis. Brought in my opinion, the best defender in the SEC last year in Jonas Aidoo. And so you have 8 players right there that any team would be envious of in America. That's a more talented team on paper than some teams that are ranked higher than them. It's just about meshing.
Yeah.
As for Kentucky, it'll be a very, very interesting decision on how good this team is because you have to believe that you're going to get some talent to mesh, but this isn't a Kentucky roster on paper. Like, there is no NBA frontline talent on this team. Like, there's been Kentucky teams that don't have a top 10 pick, but they still have a guy who's picked in the first round. This is a bunch of transfers that were from smaller schools and played smaller roles. For instance, Jackson Robinson is like highly ranked on these 2-guard rankings. He was a backup. Like, I know he was intentionally a 6-man, the 6-man for BYU, and they came out of nowhere. They were picked 13th in their conference. They ended up overachieving, but I'm just giving you the background. Otega Away was probably the 6th best player in Oklahoma last year. Butler was a starter for San Diego State, but he wasn't all that incredible. Colin Chandler, recruit. My brother actually grew up playing with him. Like, these guys don't seem like the world beaters that Kentucky have typically had. Their center is coming from Drexel, Amari Williams. So on paper, Arkansas is a lot better to me, but anything's going to happen. And if you ask me who's going to win that game, I'd put Kentucky. Just home crowd, a little bit of revenge on the mind. Kentucky is going to have an interesting year. There's going to be a lot of talk made about how good of a coach is Mark Pope, how good is that roster, can they contend? To me, it's about making the tournament, being a top 8 seed rather than contending. I don't think they can. Arkansas should have every aspiration of winning a championship, and this will be a test on how well Calipari can coach, because he can recruit. But I've been saying it for years. The guy prioritized recruiting, and his pipeline to the NBA over winning, and eventually it caught up to him. So this year will be hey, let me show you guys that I can coach, and it'll be it'll have people spectating and excited, absolutely, and it's good for the college basketball game, but it's going to be a bit of a crucible for Calipari. Like, he has to prove it, and if he can't, then he's got to live with the bed he made of just being a recruiter.
You kind of touched on some of this in that response there already, but I'm curious. It's kind of a 2-part question. Which of these 2 coaches has more pressure on them for the season in general? Just who is under more pressure and scrutiny in their first season at their new program versus who is feeling more pressure to win this basketball game? Because in my opinion, I'll give you my thoughts here. The answer for each is different. I think there's more pressure, it's kind of hard because the pressure is different types of pressure, but I think there's a little bit more pressure on Calipari in year 1 because his roster is better on paper, because he's got, a very obvious potential All-American candidate in John L. Davis, because he's got NBA caliber talent in players like Big Z, like Trevin Brazil is potentially in that category. Obviously, DJ Wagner was expected to be in that category before not doing as much as they thought he would last year. The freshmen are all potential NBA players, whereas at Kentucky, like you said, Jackson Robinson flirted with the draft, and maybe he gets in that conversation later. And who knows, maybe somebody like Brandon Garrison pops or Andrew Carr or some of the other players on that team who I think could potentially be like NBA role players, but there's no kind of superstars on that team. And so I think for Pope, the pressure in year 1 is still there. There's never not pressure when you're the head coach in Lexington, but I think there is kind of we're going to give him a little bit of time. Whereas for Arkansas, sure, they're not going to fire Cal after 1 year, but there is this pressure of like, hey, you got to win. Like, this is a team that has the talent to do it. And then on the flip side of that, I think the pressure in this actual contest falls far more squarely on Mark Pope. You got to win this game. You have to win this game in Lexington against the former coach. Like, it is just like, obviously winning NCAA tournament games is the most important thing Mark Pope could do, especially in light of his track record in that area and the failures of Calipari. But this is the most important game for Mark Pope to win outside of anything in the NCAA tournament. You got to beat Coach Calipari. That's my read on the situation, at least.
Yeah, I agree with both sides of that. I think that game is going to be Kentucky's holy grail this year. I don't think, even if Kentucky were to make the Sweet 16 but lose that game, I think people will be frustrated. Yeah. Now, if they were to lose in the first round, I think you'd still be frustrated because it's Kentucky, you have aspirations. But I think if you win that game and lose in the first round, it kind of gets swept under the rug.
Yeah.
And as for Arkansas, I think they have 1 year of lenience. They're going to be frustrated if they don't contend. Like, if they don't make an Elite 8, I don't think it's the end of the world.
Yeah.
But if they don't make an Elite 8, Final Four in the first 2-3 years, I think Calipari, the plug's going to be pulled because there's going to be frustration saying, oh, you're just a recruiter, you don't win. Because early in his Kentucky days, before he truly established that pipeline to the NBA, they still had NBA guys, don't get me wrong. Like early on, they had the John Wall, the DeMarcus Cousins, but those teams were making the Elite Eights, the Final Fours. Well, they haven't done that in a long time, and that'll be the focus now. And I think he actually has a good mix of youth and just veteran leaders and players that are really good. Like John L. Davis should be an All-American.
Yeah.
You bring in other players like Jonas Aidoo, I mentioned. I mean, Brazil, I'm not the biggest fan, but if you have him as your like 7th best player, you're in a pretty good situation.
Yeah. Well, Texas and Oklahoma, newcomers into the SEC. Obviously, a lot of the focus on that has been football, but we do want to talk about what their conference slate looks like as members of the SEC basketball side of things. Some other highly intriguing matchups in the SEC as well. All of that coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you folks about today's sponsored Game Time. Going to live events is the absolute best. Music, theater, comedy, and of course now college sports are coming back. And I'm so glad that I used Game Time this summer to check out a play downtown with my wife. It was our first outing without our infant child. We used Game Time, got some cheap seats. It was fantastic. And I'm looking forward to making new memories in that area during the college sports season. And great news, when you're getting tickets this year, Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. And folks, Arkansas at Kentucky is not available yet. Again, this schedule just came out. However, if you're looking for another great matchup in Lexington, the Cats are hosting Louisville in the non-conference slate. The tickets are at a major discount right now. A pair of tickets in section 213 on a balcony looking over center court is just $316 a pair. So you can check that out. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Folks, download the Game Time app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download the Game Time app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is also brought to you by FanDuel. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Usually we're filling you in on a boost or a bonus offer from FanDuel. Well, we have something a little different for you right now. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. And folks, SEC teams right now are dominating the top of the FanDuel's projections for who's going to win it all in 2025 right now. Alabama plus 1,300 odds to take home the national championship. Auburn's behind them at plus 2,500, and then you get the two teams we just talked about. Arkansas at plus 3,000. Kentucky follows suit at plus 3,500. So folks, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. All right, Leaf, segment 2, continuing our conversation here, talking about the SEC basketball schedules. Talked a lot about what the Arkansas and Kentucky matchup means. If you want to hear more about that matchup, more about those two teams, check out Locked On Kentucky and Locked On Arkansas, two fantastic shows on the network. Lance Staw does a great job with Locked On Kentucky, and John Neighbors does a fantastic job with, I think it's Locked On Razorbacks is the name over there, so definitely check out those two shows if you have not done so yet. We're going to look at some other teams here in the SEC, specifically the two newcomers, Texas and Oklahoma. And Leaf, I'm going to talk a little bit about each of their first matchup for each of these two teams in conference play. We can talk about which of these first matchups for these two new teams we're most excited about. First, Texas, the Longhorns. They open up SEC play at Texas A&M. Game is on January 4th. It is the first time these two teams will face each other since 2019. And that was on a neutral site game. This is going to be the first time either of these teams have played each other on their home court in over 10 years. So the SEC said, all right, Texas, you're here, you're in it. We're going to get you straight back in to this fun in-state rivalry here, send you out to go play A&M at their home floor. Both teams kind of considered top 25-ish programs right now. I've seen kind of A&M kind of floating right on the periphery of being a top 25 team. Texas tends to be in that top 15 range. And then Oklahoma, they didn't do them any favors either. First matchup of conference play for Porter Moser's team. They're sending them on the road to Tuscaloosa to take on the Crimson Tide. Again, that game is also on January 4th. Oklahoma is probably going to be unranked. I guess we'll see if they have a hot non-conference like they did last year. We'll talk a little bit more about some of their non-conference games in the final segment as they are in the battle for Atlantis. But Alabama by January 4th, unless things go really poorly, they're probably a top 5 team. So this is a really tough matchup for the Sooners, a team that has yet to make the NCAA tournament under Coach Porter Moser, yet is kind of trying to take that leap. They're moving out of the Big 12, which is a great conference, but things don't get a lot easier for them in the SEC. So, Leaf, you got Texas at A&M and you got Oklahoma at Alabama. Which of these matchups are you most excited about for the 2 newcomers in this conference?
Texas and A&M, because one, it's an old rivalry, and the first one back always means something. You saw teams get ripped away from conferences and now rejoin in the SEC. In this case, I think Texas A&M left about 11 years ago to go to the SEC. Well, now Texas followed suit. And the interesting part to me is the fear of playing against a power conference team that's a rivalry when you'd have to do a home and home has infiltrated college basketball and football. You almost never see old school rivals that are now in different conferences play each other because they don't want to lose early, and those games mean more. Well, now you can't avoid it, and I think that's great. I actually I would say that Texas A&M has the team I'm more optimistic about than Texas. Texas may have top-notch talent, but they've got a lot of moving pieces.
Yeah.
Rodney Terry's got to prove it to me that it wasn't just Chris Beard's recruiting and coaching implemented style when he made that run to the Elite Eight. And they probably should have made the Final Four, frankly. Like Miami beat them from behind. But, they bring in Trey Johnson. He's a 5-star. He could be an NBA guy. They bring in Jordan Pope, who I really liked at Oregon State. Tremont Mark, who I liked at Arkansas, as well as Houston before that. But there's a lot of ball-dominant players right there. I just named 3 of them. And you need someone to settle it down. I don't think Weaver is necessarily your point guard. He's your energy guy. You want your energy guy to play well. It's redundant. All those guys play a similar position. So I'm curious to see how they work on that. I think Caden Shedrick should have a bit of a bounce-back year, play a little bit better. But Texas A&M's got the same pieces. They got Buzz Williams, who I really believe in as a coach. I think Texas A&M wins that game in College Station, which is not revelatory. It's not crazy. But I actually think they're the team that I have more faith in going forward in the SEC, which when you said the rankings, I hadn't really looked at anyone else's rankings. This is kind of just the way I perceive basketball. So I'm a little shocked that it's the opposite. I think I have Texas A&M around 12 and I have Texas around 20. So I'm actually flipped.
Yeah, I've seen them flipped in a couple of spots. I think I was going off of CBS's rankings when I made that comment, but I think that's generally the consensus at this point. We'll see as we get closer into the season. But yeah, I'm with you on a lot of that. I think A&M has a pretty complete roster. I think they made some nice additions. Their offseason was a little bit more under the radar, but I think it was quality in what they did, and I do have a lot of faith in Buzz Williams. And the Oklahoma Alabama, obviously there's not a rivalry aspect there, but at Alabama is one of the toughest games in the SEC, if not the toughest game that you can play in the SEC this upcoming season. So definitely not an easy task for Porter Moser. A couple other games that I just kind of wanted to highlight here quickly. Arkansas at Tennessee, that is also on January 4th. So that's going to be a big day in the SEC. Cal's first SEC game at Arkansas, the return of Jonas Aidoo to go play against his old team at Tennessee. We're going to see how that kind of goes for him. Tennessee, interesting team. How are they going to look in the post Dalton Connect era post Santiago Vescovi? Obviously, they get Chaz Lanier in from North Florida. They're kind of hoping for a similar jump from him, but that's going to be an intriguing matchup. A couple others real quickly. Bama at Auburn. Can't not name Bama at Auburn. It's also on the final day of the SEC scheduled, March 8th, 2025 for that game. Don't know what the standings are going to look like at that point, but I think it's a fairly safe bet that Bama at Auburn in the final game, final day of the season is going to have some ramifications for at least seeding in the SEC tournament, probably at the very top. And then a couple Florida games. Florida at Kentucky just kind of tickled me as 2 former coaches in the WCC, Todd Golden from San Francisco, and of course Mark Pope from BYU, now taking each other on January 4th. And then Florida at Arkansas a week later, January 11th. I mostly mentioned that one because it is a reunion of sorts for John L. Davis and Elijah Martin, both who were stars for that FAU team that went to the Final Four. Davis, of course, at Arkansas, and Elijah Martin, a new addition for Golden and the Gators. Any of those games, or maybe any other games that kind of stand out to you on this schedule, Leaf?
All of them. I mean, the SEC is great.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I could talk about all those matchups, but I'll take it this way.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone loves the Big 12, and
Mm-hmm.
the reason they've loved it in recent years has been the depth, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would argue Houston was the only team with a chance last year to make the Final
Mm-hmm.
Four. They got hurt.
Mm-hmm.
Iowa State didn't score enough. Kansas, who's the torchbearer, not very good. Well, you
Mm-hmm.
probably got 5 teams that'll be in the top 10 or 11
Mm-hmm.
from the Big 12, and then the depth thins out this year. So you take the top heaviness of the Big 12, and then they're going to have teams that make it. Don't get me wrong. They're going to have other teams besides the top 5, but that's really the strength. I'm not sure the SEC doesn't get 11 teams in.
Yeah.
Like, if I rank it out, I would probably go Alabama, number 1. I would then have some amalgamation of Arkansas, Texas A&M, Tennessee, and let me find my notes. I wrote these all out at one point. Okay, so I'd have Texas A&M, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Auburn all in my top 15. They'd probably all be 10 through 15. Then I'd probably have Ole Miss, Florida, Kentucky, Texas, all in my top 25.
Yeah.
That's 10 teams right there.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine any of those teams not making it, right?
And that's 10 teams in the top 20. I mean, I really am. So the reason I say all of them is all those teams figured to be good. And then there's a few other teams I didn't mention in the top 25 that I think will make the tournament. Like South Carolina was a 6th seed last year. South Carolina gets back a freshman and Colin Murray-Broyles, who should be an all SEC player. That team was really, really solid, ran into a nightmare matchup in Oregon.
Yeah.
And yeah, so every game in the SEC is going to be fun for people like you and I who follow this and know the nuances, because there's the coaching carousel has the enormous impact nationally, but the styles are very different team to team. I'm really excited to see what Florida can do under Todd Golden year 3. He's got a lot of returning pieces. Walter Clayton State, he's going to play the point guard this year. Can they operate in that same level offensively but improve defensively? If so, that dangerous Florida team we saw and really liked before Handglockton got hurt, all of a sudden, that's probably a top 20 team. And so, I don't know. There's 9 teams that if you told me, hey, here's their home game, I could pick out 10 home games for each team. So I'm thrilled about the SEC.
Yep.
I think it's not that crazy to say that they're the best conference in America, despite the Big 12 being the shoe-in, and they deserve it. The Big 12's got 5 teams I perceive to be top 10 caliber.
You talk about the 10 teams that we feel very likely make the tournament out of the SEC, and that doesn't include Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Missouri, or South Carolina. It's hard to imagine none of those teams making it. It's kind of hard to imagine less than 2 of those teams making it. So yeah, you're talking about a bunch of teams from the SEC. And obviously, who knows? We're kind of banking on a growth from Missouri. We don't know if that's actually going to happen, but it's a really, really deep league. And I'm with you, Leaf. It's going to be a lot of fun to watch SEC basketball all year long. But folks, want to move on, want to talk about the news that came out right before we hit the record button. The Battle for Atlantis matchups are officially set. There is a highly anticipated potential championship matchup between a former assistant coach and his longtime boss. And we're going to talk about what that matchup could be and whether it's likely to happen, all coming up in just a second. But first, folks, let's talk about today's sponsor, Ibata. The summer is almost over, and lots of folks are taking their dream end of the summer vacation, but dreading the cost. With Ibata, you can get cash back on every single one of your purchases, so you can spend more time making memories this summer and less time dreaming about them. Ibata is a free app that lets you earn cash back every time you shop. Earn on hundreds of items from groceries to beauty supplies, even kids' toys, so you can make sure you're beating inflation no matter what you're purchasing. Folks, the average Ibata user earns $256 per year. That could cover the cost of an entire shopping trip, that flight you've been eyeing, or the fancy dinner you and your spouse have been craving. It's time you join the over 50 million users who use Ibata to earn cash back every single time they shop. Right now, Ibata is offering our listeners $5 just for trying the app by using the code LOCKEDONCollege when you register. Just go to the App Store or Google Play Store, download the free Ibata app, and start earning cash back using code LOCKEDONCollege. That's IBOTTA in the Google Play or Apple App Store using code LOCKEDONCollege. All right, Leaf, closing out the show today with the news that the Battle for Atlantis matchups are set. Of course, the Battle for Atlantis, one of the most prestigious and well-known MTE events that take place in over Feast Week and Thanksgiving. This tournament, November 27th through the 29th is the dates this year. It's in the Bahamas, again, alongside the Maui Invitational and ESPN events. It's kind of one of the flagship MTEs that we see every year during that kind of Thanksgiving time. The field has been altered, or at least it was altered a few months ago. We talked about it on the show, but just as a reminder, Creighton was initially expected to be a part of the battle for Atlantis. They have dropped out of the event in order to be in the Players Era Invitational. That is the NIL-based event taking place in Las Vegas. Probably not going to be the last time we see teams drop out of commitments in order to join that event, since each team is promised money, $1 million in this case, NIL money just for participating in the event. Providence replaced Creighton, and they are an intriguing team added into this mix. It's kind of a unique field. Leaf, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read each of the first round games. There's 4 total matchups. Just read the matchup, talk about what we like about each matchup, and then we can kind of take a look at how the games might go, who we might see in the championship, and the specific matchup that I think most people are hopefully or are expecting to look forward to for this one. First, you got Louisville versus Indiana. Pat Kelsey, new coach over there for the Cardinals. Can they establish themselves in year one? They got a really talented roster. Anything is better than what they've been the last couple of years, but certainly having some success in this tournament will help. Meanwhile, Mike Woodson already kind of on the hot seat. A lot of success in terms of adding players to the roster, but not a ton of success on the floor. So this is a big tournament for Woodson and the Hoosiers. West Virginia versus Gonzaga. Big early chance for Darian DeVries, the new head coach of the Mountaineers. His son, Tucker DeVries, on that roster as well. 20-point per game score at Drake. How does that translate into the Big 12? We'll get an early look at that here in this tournament. Oklahoma versus Providence. Porter Moser versus Kim English. Fun matchup there. Sooners, as we said, kind of looking to break through in the 4th season of Moser's tenure. Meanwhile, Providence looking for a big year 2 under Coach English. 2 teams that just missed the NCAA tournament last year, so I think both are kind of eyeing this game and this tournament as a good opportunity to pick up a marquee non-conference victory. And then you got Davidson versus Arizona. It felt like either Gonzaga or Arizona was going to draw Davidson, kind of the more obvious weak team in this field. Still not a bad team by any stretch. They did lose a ton of talent this offseason, and I think Arizona is going to be the fairly heavy favorite in this one, especially with their roster. Caleb Love's back, Jaden Bradley's back, KJ Lewis is going to be stepping up into a bigger role. Trey Townsend comes over from Oakland, Toby Awaka from Tennessee. This is an exciting team for the Wildcats. What of those 4 matchups kind of stand out to you, Leaf?
Louisville and Indiana for sure, because both those teams and their fan bases are basketball crazy. They want nothing more than to be great at basketball, and neither of whom have really been very good in 8-9 years.
Yeah, a while.
Like Yogi Ferrell took this team to the Sweet 16, and that was in 2016. They lost to the eventual champions. Or actually, maybe that was 17. They lost to Carolina, regardless. And Louisville, the last time they were good is when Peyton Siva, Russ Smith, all those guys. They had another year where they were close with Montrezl Harrell, but they weren't there. Well, that's way too long. Like we talk about Kentucky not winning, they still had teams that made the Elite 8 in the past 5 years. Like it's just relative to Kentucky expectations. These teams perceive themselves as blue bloods. They're not, in my opinion, but they're certainly in the basketball royalty.
Yeah.
Well, Pat Kelsey comes in. There's a lot of talent on that roster now. Do I believe in them? Not particularly. But if you were to look at the roster and you say, okay, what team's more talented in the ACC, and you exclude Duke and Carolina, I'm not sure they're not the answer. Like they have a bunch of talent. Indiana brought in 2 of the best guards in the transfer portal and paid $1 billion, hypothetical, like not that much, but a lot for Umar Ballo. So they have Umar Ballo, Miles Rice, who I really, really wanted to go to Stanford as an aside.
Yeah.
Coach there. Miles Rice and Cannon Carlisle from Stanford. And you have, so you basically have 2 what would have been all Pac-12 guards had they come back, and all Pac-12 big, and you kept Malik Renew, Trey Galloway, a few other players. These teams are both teams that have on paper talent, but it needs to materialize. And the winner of this game takes it in the right step for the rest of the season. And this could be a big game in seeding. Like I think both these teams are probably bubble teams the way I perceive it right now, despite being well above that talent-wise. That's just what I expect. So this is certainly the game I'll have my eyes the most peeled for in terms of the first-round games. And, of course, the championship that we all want to see is definitely the one I want to see.
Yeah.
But the field doesn't feel that strong for Battle for Atlantis. Like it feels like a weaker field, and I think it's because it's watered down because of the players. There's an MTE basically the best teams in the country, so of course it's not going to be as strong.
Yeah, exactly, and I think Creighton dropping out kind of took it from being 3 premier teams to kind of 2. Those 2 teams, of course, being Arizona and Gonzaga. And we'll see. I think Gonzaga is going to be favorites against West Virginia. They should win that game. Arizona certainly should beat Davidson. And then Arizona will play either Oklahoma or Providence, which feels at this point like a bit of a toss-up. Louisville, Indiana. I think Indiana will be favored, but I wouldn't say that that's a lock by any stretch. So you assume Gonzaga plays probably Indiana or Louisville. Either way, they are going to be favored to win there. Arizona is going to be favored over either Oklahoma or Providence. And to be clear, just because they're going to be favored does not mean they're going to win. That is not how it always shakes out. But this tournament is set up to bring us a November 29th matchup between Mark Few and his 20-year assistant coach, Tommy Lloyd, who literally worked with him for 2 decades, was the catalyst behind so many of Gonzaga's successful programs, was an international recruiter who brought the program players like Roni Turioff and Shemet Karnowski and DeMontis Sabonis. He's now at Arizona, has had a ton of regular season success, has not parlayed that success into the postseason. Got a great roster this year, although there is a lot of turnover. Meanwhile, Gonzaga has a significant amount of roster continuity. They bring 81% of their production back. They add key players in the portal to fill the spots that are absent, like the backup guard spot with Caliph Battle and the forward spot departed by Anton Watson. They bring in Michael Ajayi. Everybody wants Gonzaga versus Arizona. I think that's the obvious, clear, best potential outcome we could get out of this tournament. And Few and Lloyd have not wanted to play each other. They've kind of wanted to wait until there's a little bit less kind of mixing of the programs. Balla was one of those. He played at Gonzaga. He played at Arizona. Now Gonzaga might see him against Indiana before they get to Arizona, which is kind of a fun wrinkle here. But this is obviously the 2 coaches is the main storyline, but the fact that they play similar styles, very up-tempo, love to run and gun, not great defensively. I think this could be, if it does end up being our championship game, I don't know what FanDuel's going to set the over-under on, but if it's like 180 something, I might be hitting the over because I think there's going to be a lot of points scored in this basketball game.
180 is a lot of points.
That's pretty high. That's pretty high. I'll give you that. But
I don't hate that take. That's just a lot of points.
Yeah.
I think that both these teams have top 10 rosters. That's nothing crazy to say.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this is Gonzaga's best team since 2021, in which they were undefeated heading into the Baylor game. I hate to say this to Andy, but I was all in on Baylor. That was the most confident I've ever been about it.
They made you look good about 3 minutes into that basketball game too.
and the funny part is, I think Gonzaga is like flying under the radar right now as the national championship contender that no one's talking about. Yeah. And it's because, they've been 1 seeds, but they haven't won anything. Well, this team has got a good mix of athleticism and the kind of the guys that are the floor setters. Yeah. Like the players that raise the floor right now are Graham Ike. And you got Braden Huff, you've got Ben Gregg, these type of guys who have been in the program and are expected to be good. But the guys who will raise the ceiling are the transfers, how good they can be. Can Caliph Battle? Can Michael Ajayi complement Nembhard in the backcourt, or I guess just as wings, and put pressure on the rim, be athletic, much like Jalen Suggs was able to complement what was already established at Gonzaga and add an extra level. Yeah. So I think Gonzaga's the championship. They're hiding in plain sight, and I don't know why they're not being talked about enough. Arizona, to me, a little bit overrated. I bet you when the preseason rankings come out, Arizona and Gonzaga are right by each other. Yeah. And that would be an indication of just how good Gonzaga is. Like the year where Brandon Clark and Rui Hachimura outdueled Zion and RJ. Well, that put Gonzaga on the map. Not that they were like a small unknown commodity, but they were like, oh, that's a real contender. They're a 1 seed, and people had belief. I don't think people believed they were going to win the championship because Duke was there. Virginia was really good. North Carolina was they weren't a bigger brand than those teams. But this year, everyone's talking about Kansas, Alabama, and Duke, and rightfully so. They're awesome. But I think they're on that same par. I have Gonzaga the number 3 team in the country. I have Arizona number 10 on my own rankings. So I pray that that's the championship, not only because of Tommy Lloyd versus Mark Few, but just for my own basketball consumption.
It's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Folks, thank you so much for making this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Isaac will be back with y'all on Thursday for a new episode, and then he and I will be back on Friday to close out the week. Again, thanks, folks, for listening. Check out the show, YouTube, wherever you get your podcast. Go hit the subscribe button if you haven't done so yet, and join us on our Discord channel. Again, we'll be back on Thursday, but until then, as always, peace out.